keep reading. Number 3, this is around where we left off last week. Number 3, we've got these seals that Revelation talks about that are indicative of different events that are sequentially moving along. This is also something that we should be looking for, is as these events take place on planet Earth, we as believers who have studied our Bible should be looking for the pattern. We should say, this resembles seal 1, or seal 2, seal 3, seal 4. And therefore, with this advance warning, we will have this knowledge of the events, maybe not in the exacting details, such as we'll know the day and the hour, like Yeshua says, no man can know. But certainly, because we're not in the dark, like the Apostle Paul talks about in his letters to the Thessalonians, we are not children of the darkness, but of the light, because of our relationship to God through Yeshua and the presence of the Holy Spirit inside of us. Because of those factors, we as believers and genuine Christians, those of us who are studying our Bibles and not asleep at the wheel, those of us who are in this position will have a sense of the season of these events, and we'll be able to recognize some of the sequence and be able to be better prepared and to be able to warn our friends and family members and neighbors and co-workers and things like that about, hey, you don't need to suffer needlessly, lose your life, and then be dropped off into hell after everything's said and done because you didn't have a relationship with God. Now is the time to make your decision for Christ. Now is the day of salvation. Today is the day. Like the book of Psalms talks about, like the book of Hebrews talks about, today is the day, right? What are you going to do about God? What are you going to do about this Jesus that has been so mocked down through history and laughed at by, rabbinic Jews and rejected by Muslims and things like that? What are you going to do about him? Because his return to planet Earth is right around the corner. And this time he's coming to roar as a lion. He's not coming back as some meek, gentle little lamb who's going to let you trample all over him like he did when 2,000 years ago. He kept his mouth shut and allowed wicked humans to hang him up on a cross, right, and pierce his body, drive nails into his hands and his feet. Nope. That's not the Jesus that's going to show up this time. He's going to roar, and there's going to be a sharp sword that comes from his mouth, and he's going to slay his enemies, right? He's going to come with fire and vengeance. What are you going to do about this one? So, look at the seals. Both Matthew 24 and Revelation 6 depict the unsealing of seals representing the conclusion of times, I say. In Matthew 24, 4-5, Jesus warns against deceitful messiahs and prophets, while in Revelation 6, 1-2, right, the parallel, the first seal is broken, and a rider on a white horse emerges, symbolizing a deceitful messiah. So that's the Antichrist, right? The 4 horses of the apocalypse, right? He's the first big bad guy. All right, let's move on to to point number 4, tribulation, right? This is the time period that is going to be very distressful because it's the wrath of Satan. It's the time period allotted by God to go out and just slay people left and right. And according to Yeshua's own words, if this time period were not shortened, the tribulation, the intense wrath of Satan, if it were not cut short by God himself, then no flesh would survive. Right? The devil hates God's people first and foremost. And yet, in reality, he hates all human beings because we're created in the image of God. He hates God. He hates God's creation. He hates God's pinnacle creation, which is man, right? So if he was left unchecked, then he would just destroy everyone. He would kill all human life. That's his way of trying to defeat God's plans and purposes, which we know can't happen. So therefore, God cuts his wrath short, cuts the tribulation short. I do not believe, like some say, that this means that God is cutting the 7 years short, or the 3.5 and 3.5 years. I think those are fixed times, the 42 months and 1,260 days that we read about in multiple places. Instead, the natural context of Yeshua's words indicate that it's the tribulation of those days. When we get to it, as we start reading through Matthew 24, verse by verse, you'll see this. So both Matthew 24 and Revelation 7 portray a period of immense tribulation during the end times. And I remind everyone that in Matthew 24, 21 and 22, Jesus warns that this tribulation will be so severe right? This is what I was kind of alluding to. It'll be so severe that it will imperil humanity's survival. While in Revelation 7:14, the Great Tribulation is depicted as a period of testing for believers. Now, I hold to a position, and we'll get to this in time, known as pre-wrath. So when we're talking about tribulation for both wicked humans as well as tribulation for believers, Christians, my understanding is that believers will enter into this tribulation period because it has been foretold in the Bible. It's been prophesied that, you remember all the way going back to Daniel, it's been already prophesied that the little horn, which is Antichrist, will make war with the saints, which are both Jews and Christians, righteous Jews, who will not yield to the Antichrist's regime and its power and his program during that day. And so the little horn is going to make war with the saints and overcome them for a measured amount of time. So my understanding of these end time events is that we will go into this tribulation time period with the understanding and expectation that there will be martyrdom. This means that there won't be this pre-tribulational rapture of the saints, as in Jesus will come back before we experience any hard times. I don't see that in Yeshua's words. I see that instead he's telling his disciples there is going to come times of distress. There are going to be tribulational times, and you need to be prepared for them. Don't just think that I'm going to come and rescue away from all that. Although there is the blessed hope that even in the middle of the tribulation, when things are just seeming like they can't get any worse, there will be a rescue. The rapture represents that rescue, and it also represents the cutting short of the tribulation by the Antichrist. Remember, Yeshua said those days must be cut short. So I see a pre-wrath rapture, where the word wrath in my definition is the wrath of God that's poured out on wicked humanity, not to be confused with the wrath of Satan that's poured out on humanity. And the timing, the sequence of these two events that I'm talking about, these two sets of wrath, is crucially important. The wrath of Satan precedes the wrath of God. So we'll get to that in time, but I dropped that teaser into your lap for a moment. Right now, let's keep reading my own notes here. So at point number 5, the chosen. Both Matthew 24 and Revelation 7 describe the chosen ones, the faithful believers who will be saved during the end time. So even though saints will not have been raptured away yet, and even though there'll be this intense persecution and all literal hell will be breaking loose on planet Earth, there's still the opportunity to embrace the gospel, and there will be, a measured amount of successful, what we might call evangelistic campaigns during the end times. Let's keep reading. In Matthew 24:22-31, Jesus assures that the chosen will be spared from the tribulation, while in Revelation 7:1-8, the 144,000 are identified as the chosen ones who will be sealed and protected during the tribulation. So this is where there's a lot of debate. There is some protection. There is a measured amount of, hey, God told the woman to flee into the desert where she has a place prepared for her for 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. This is near the end of Revelation chapter 12. We'll get to that in time. So yes, there will be a measured amount, like I said, there will be some protection, but there's also this great martyrdom. And when we talk about martyrs, we're not talking about the destruction of the wicked. We're not talking about Antichrist simply wiping out people left and right because he hates mankind that was created in the image of God. That's not what I mean by martyrdom. The biblical term for martyrdom entails this idea of someone who loses his life because he is a witness. He bears testimony of the truth. So martyrdom implies believers or faithful people, those who have a claim that they trust in God and or they are known to be followers of Jesus, the one true Messiah. They lose their life because of their belief, because of their faithfulness, not just simply casualties in this whole wrath of Satan that's poured out. That's not what we mean by martyrdom. So I don't want you to misunderstand. My understanding is martyrdom is for those who lose their life on planet Earth and then are taken up to heaven. And then at that point, John, in the Revelation letter, describes these souls under the altar who are crying out for justice because of the fact that they were martyred, right? Meaning they lost their lives because they kept their faith, and therefore they are now crying out to God for vindication, for justification, for retribution, for God to pour out his own recompense, to judge wicked humanity and the Antichrist for this terrible injustice of taking our lives when we were faithful to God, that type of thing. That's what we mean by martyrdom. And then moving along, point number 6, the culmination. We've got both Matthew 24 and Revelation 6-7 illustrating for us the conclusion of the era and the return of Jesus. This is really why Yeshua used the analogy of the birth pangs and the labor pains that women go through before they give birth. In this analogy, the labor pains precede the intense labor, they precede the birth of the baby. So in this case, the birth of the baby is the Messiah's kingdom that's ushered in to planet Earth. The return of Jesus physically and bodily to planet Earth to bring in the kingdom that his Father already promised was going to be established. And where do we read this? Again, way back in Daniel chapter 7 again. You've got to remember, we looked at Daniel over and over again earlier, and so go back and read it on your own. It's a short chapter. Daniel sees a vision of the Ancient of Days, which is God the Father, seated on his throne, and then one like the Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days. And this only makes sense when we realize that the Aramaic Bar Enosh corresponds to the Hebrew Ben Adam, which being translated as Son of Man simply indicates human being. So one like a human being Daniel sees, which is obviously the incarnated Jesus, approaches the Ancient of Days and is given this kingdom which will last forever. That's the culmination of the era. That's the baby that's being brought into reality, the end of this age and the ushering in of the age to come, the Olam Haba, which in Jewish circles, that's the age to come, as contrasted to the Olam Hazeh, this current age that we live in right now. So the wickedness of this age is going to culminate in the return of Jesus to planet Earth to establish his 1,000-year kingdom. I keep reading. In Matthew 24 and 29 to 31, Jesus delineates the signs of his arrival, right? All those seals that are breaking, remember, there's a sequence to them when we finally get to the book of Revelation. And we even see this in Matthew, and we'll get to it, and we're going to start probably looking at it even tonight. At certain points during his discourse to his disciples there on the Mount of Olives, he starts saying, when you see this happen, and then when you see this, and then, and then, and then. And the indication of the sequence of words that he's using, when, and then, let us know that there is a progression, that there's not just this happen chance, everything's kind of just happening all at once. It's not this total chaos that's going on in planet Earth, although it might feel that way to people who are not reading the Bible, people who aren't Christians, people who aren't following after God's signs. To the rest of the world, it'll just look like utter chaos. Everything's happening all at once because there'll be some overlapping, obviously, right? An earthquake takes place, and there's all the especially if it's an earthquake at sea, like a tsunami or something. There'll be an earthquake, and then there'll be a tsunami that follows after that, and then there'll just be flooding, and then there'll be, of course, the famines that follow after that, and the pestilence and the disease, and then on top of that, we'll have all kinds of wars and rumors of wars, and nations rising against nations, and of course we'll have Antichrist on the scene doing his thing. So all of this will seem to the world like it's just disaster after disaster that's piled up one on top of one another, and there's no sense to the matter. But for those who are reading the Bible, there is a definite progression. leading to a culmination and some sort of sequence of the events, right? So we talk about signs of his arrival, including the darkening of the sun and the moon, while in Revelation 6 to 12 and 17, the sixth seal is broken, and John sees that the sky rolls up like a scroll, signaling what? The end of the era. So, with the signs that we're going to be looking at as we parallel Matthew with Revelation, the reason is given by Yeshua himself for these signs. He tells his disciples, I'm telling you these things in advance so that you'll be warned, so that you will know in advance the signs that will indicate my return. And we talked about this last week, and then I'll jump right into my notes here. When we're talking about the return of Yeshua to planet Earth, when we're dealing with the end of the age, the very tail end of the 70th week of Daniel, and the ushering in of the 1,000-year millennial kingdom, I believe what we're talking about is the physical return of Jesus to allow his feet to touch the Mount of Olives and to be recognized as the Lord returning to earth to establish his rule, right? At that point in time, he's going to deal with his enemies, defeat the Antichrist and the false prophet, drop them off into hell, and then establishes sheep and goat judgment, Matthew chapter 25, and then allow for those who are righteous to enter into his kingdom and rule and reign with him for 1,000 years. Well, this second coming of Jesus to planet Earth in bodily form also includes sometime in this time frame includes the rapture, which happened, in my understanding, prior to the physical bodily return. In other words, during the rapture, Yeshua doesn't have to his feet doesn't have to touch planet Earth. He comes in the clouds, and we're caught up to meet him in the air. That's what Paul's going to go on to teach in the Thessalonian letters. We're caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So this second coming of Christ that we talk about in kind of broad terms includes details that would outline the rapture and the second coming at the end of the age. So keep those details in mind as we begin to read through this. And it becomes important because it helps us to, again, chart chronologically how is the end of the age going to play out. Even though we don't know the day or the hour, we will be able to have a sense of the season of the events, and thus we should not be confused by the false Christ that say, I'm him, my kingdom is here. Remember, Yeshua warned us over and over again that there'll be people who claim to be him here and there and everywhere, and thus they are going to try and deceive people. Antichrist himself is the charlatan, the consummate deceptive Antichrist, the one who claims to be Christ, right? But even though many people are going to follow after him, Yeshua said, don't be fooled, speaking to his followers, speaking to his disciples. So let's begin to look at my notes here. Let's return after looking at the chart and looking at some of the intense parallels. Here's what I have to say. Altogether, the parallels between Matthew 24 and Revelation chapters 6 to 7 propose that these passages expound on the same events and themes associated with the culmination of times, meaning we're talking about the exact same events. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and Luke chapter 21. They all parallel against the Revelation chapter 6 and 7. I go on to say that both passages, speaking of just Matthew, since that's the only one we're looking at, it's the one that's most comprehensive, so that's the only one I'm really pulling into my study for now. Both passages stress the importance of spiritual preparedness and steadfastness in the face of persecution and tribulation, offering the promise of salvation and deliverance for the chosen. Again, that deliverance is the ultimate will ultimately be vindicated when we return with Yeshua as he establishes his kingdom. But before that, he will also rescue us from this wicked persecution with the cutting short of the wrath of Satan, the tribulation, by use of the event known as the rapture. So, again, just, buckle yourself in, because according to what my understanding of the scriptures are, which is not just mine personally, obviously, when I say mine, I'm talking about a position that is well tested and has really withstood a lot of scrutiny. The pre-wrath position, which we'll talk about in time. But let me keep reading my notes here. So I go on to say that while there may be some differences in the specific details of these passages, right, different rapture views, etc., the overall message instills hope and assurance for believers who remain devoted to Jesus during the end times. And I keep stressing this fact, I won't belabor it that much, but don't think that when those days come, when Antichrist pours out his wrath, when all of the tribulation is rearing its ugly head, don't think to yourself, I'm clever enough to outsmart the Antichrist. I don't need God. I don't need Jesus. I don't need any such Christian faith. I just need to have enough, and then fill in the blank with whatever you think is going to get you through that time. Your portfolio, your prestige, your power, your wealth, your money, your position in life, your PhDs, all of that stuff. All of your clever devices that give you comfort these days, all of your smart technology and things like that, all of your protection, all of your weapons, right? All of your stockpiled goods and food that you've got hidden in a secret bunker somewhere. And you're thinking, I'm going to outsmart this guy and I'm going to make it through. Well, yeah, there might be some people who do just by chance make it through that time period. And they think to themselves, good for me. I made it, right? And I didn't need God or Jesus. And they might even go into the millennium. We'll talk about the details of who's going to actually enter into the millennium. Who is Yeshua going to let into his kingdom? But the primary thrust of the scriptural message, the message of the Bible, is unambiguous. Trust in God. Trust in his Messiah. Don't be on the wrong side of the equation when these events play themselves out. There's only really one certain way that you're going to make it in that last day. Even if you lose your life, you're going to be resurrected and taken into heaven, and then you'll come back down from heaven and return with Yeshua to usher in his kingdom. So even if you lose your life, that's not the end. But there's really only one true way to guarantee that everything will be okay for you, and that's to place your trust in God and in his son, Jesus Christ. That's it. There is no other solution to what's going to happen in planet Earth. And that's the thrust of the Bible. That is the direction that the New Testament writers point at. That's the direction that all of Jesus' prophecies are indicating and point to. Trust in me, Yeshua says over and over again. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father except through me. You cannot and will not save your soul unless you go through me. He is the only way.